Hey everybody. If you guys watched my previous video about the Dell Dimension 3100, how it had such a really sorry power supply in it, I recommend you go ahead and watch that if you haven't. If you have, here is that power supply. We are going to open it up and have a look inside, just to see how crappy the quality is inside of it. It's not as bad as these cheap knockoff like 450, 500 watt power supplies you can get for like $10, but it don't seem too far from it. Let's go ahead and look inside. It's really funny, I just made a video about a good quality Dell 350 watt power supply that came out of a Dimension, I think 8400, something like that, which was probably a 2005 computer, had XP Media Center 05 on it, and I just couldn't get over how good the quality was of the unit. The only problem with it was it had a burnt out ATX 12 connection, which that was the reason why I even looked inside in the first place. Yet, in 2006, they manufactured the Dell Dimension 3100, and they include such a knockoff power supply, 230 watts, which I'll go over the outputs here in just a minute, one final time. I'm really surprised they managed to get by with such a knockoff power supply in the first place. Anyways, let's have a look here again. For those who never did watch the first video, let's go ahead and look at the specs. It is model N230N, which I believe is a Newton manufactured unit. It takes 6.5 amps out of the wall at 120 volts, and it takes 4 amps out of the wall at 240 volts at 50 to 60 hertz. Anyways, outputs 230 watt max. They said, okay, 5 volt rail is 19 amps, 12 volt rail is 14 amps, 5 volt standby is 1 amp, minus 12 volt is 1 amp, 3.3 volt rail is 5 amps, which I compared it with a Bestech HCX 300 12E, and it had much better outputs than this Dell. I installed the 12E 300 watt unit into the Dell, and it runs much happier now. Which, anyways, that Bestech was actually pulled from E-Machine, but don't get me wrong, that's not the power supply. That's not the power supply that killed motherboards like crazy. That was the 250 that done that. Anyways, back to the point. Let's go ahead and crack open this Dell power supply, this Newton power supply, and let's see how good or how bad the quality is. If I can get it open. It's a tricky design on the casing. Okay, here we go. Okay. And we're gonna unplug the fan. Give me just a moment here. Oh my gosh, I'm looking at it already. It is very, very horrible. Just a matter of fact, I'm actually going to compare this with some cheap power supplies I got laying around. I don't see any bad components in here, but there's not very many. Have a look. This is not very good at all. We do have some filtering components up here. We do have our filtering capacitors and coils. We do have our capacitors going straight to ground on the corner, the blue capacitors, that's typical. We do have, we do have MOVs next to the big primary capacitors. And I'm not exactly sure what they're rated at. Let me see if I can find out. They're hard to see. Just bear with me here. It looks like 680 microfarads, so they actually did well on the capacitors. That's the only thing. Anyways, transformers are quite small. Heat sinks, they're about almost you could call a joke. Not many capacitors there. This coil here is not very big. It does have the 24-pin connection, 2 Molex 4-pin connections, an ACX 12-volt, and 2 SAT connections. You was to load that up fully, it would probably kill this power supply, in my opinion. I'm surprised the thing actually was able to power the stock computer. I mean, this is horrible. I mean, you see this big old bare spot on the circuit board. There's not much to this thing. I mean, there's not that many capacitors, let alone not many outputs. This is about sorry. Let me go grab a cheap power supply just to do a comparison. Okay. Let's have a look here. Just from a glance, which power supply board do you think has more stuff? I mean, this one doesn't have many things in terms of filtering, but in terms of the transformers, the heat sinks, and that sort of stuff, which do you think has more? Looks like this one does. This is a really cheap knockoff, supposedly 580 watt power supply, which these have a pretty high failure rate. At least this one could probably at least do 250 to 300 watts possibly. The heat sinks are actually bigger and more efficient than the ones in this Newton power supply. Let's look at the capacitor count on the output. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 capacitors. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we could almost say 7 capacitors, not exactly sure. So same capacitor count. There's a few more output leads on this unit. It had 4 Molex connections, 1 SATA connection, a 24-pin connection, and a 4-pin ATX 12-volt connection. So this Newton power supply is about as bad, well, in some ways worse than this cheap knockoff power supply. Now let me go grab a good quality 300 watt power supply board. Now let's compare these two. On the right we have a Delta power supply, it's a 300 watt. And of course we have our crappy Newton Dell 230 watt power supply. This power supply here is actually older than this one. Have a look at this one right quick. Now let's have a look at this one. This one has heat sinks that are a little bit better. We have good filtering chokes, 2 of them actually here. This one only has 1. We have probably the same amount of filtering components here. We have a rectifier bridge, which both these units have. The transformers on the Delta are much bigger. The capacitors here, let me have a look at these. These are hard to read too. Okay, 560 microfarads. So I think the ones in a Newton power supply have a higher rating than the Delta, but still, just look at this. We have, I think about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 capacitors. I don't know. Same capacitor count, but just think about it. This versus this. You got me? This board looks more bare to me. Let's go and have a look at the connections here. We have 20-pin ATX connection, 4-pin ATX 12-volt connection. We have a single floppy connection, and 4 of these 4-pin Molex connections. The Dell power supply also has a floppy connection as well. But still though, I mean, this thing don't even weigh that much. And as you saw how close it came in comparison with a cheap power supply, it's really sad. Anyways, these are just my own personal opinions. You guys may have different opinions, it all depends. Anyways, any questions or comments, feel free to ask.